The wind howled through the hills as the sun dipped behind the towering mountains, casting long shadows across the sprawling Silver Creek Ranch. Jackson Montgomery stood by the stables, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold, his rugged hands gripping the worn leather reins of his horse. He had worked this land for years, alone and undisturbed. His only company the cattle, the horses, and the steady rhythm of ranch life. But as the years passed, something had changed inside him, something that had hardened his heart, making him retreat further from the world. He had no time for distractions, no space for people who might get in the way of his mission, to keep the ranch running, no matter the cost. And then there she was. Ella Harper was nothing like the women he'd known in town, who were often concerned with appearances or what others thought. Ella had none of the usual airs that most women carried. She was a young woman with worn boots, a simple brown coat that hung loosely around her small frame, and a face that had seen more hardship than most people her age. Her dark eyes gleamed with determination, and though she was thin, there was a quiet strength in her posture that told Jackson she was not one to back down. She approached him as he finished tacking up the horse, her steps slow but purposeful. When she stopped just a few feet away, he didn't look up right away, but the air shifted. There was something about her presence that stirred something inside him, a curiosity, an interest, but mostly annoyance. He didn't need this. "I'm looking for work," Ella said, her voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. "I heard there's a ranch nearby that needs help. I'm unemployed, but I can work hard." Jackson finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. She didn't look like a typical ranch hand, but then again, maybe that was the point. Most ranch hands didn't show up in town without some prior connection or word of mouth. He couldn't imagine how she would be any help. The ranch was hard work, backbreaking, grueling labor. It required a level of experience and stamina that he doubted she possessed. "What makes you think you can handle the work here?" he asked, his voice rough from years of use, his gaze scanning her like a judge reviewing evidence. "This ranch isn't for the faint of heart." Ella didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with a quiet confidence that caught him off guard. "I worked on farms before. I've done everything from feeding animals to fixing fences. I'm strong. I can work sun up to sundown, and I'll give it everything I've got." Jackson felt his lips curl into a half smile, though it was more out of amusement than belief. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she was trying to convince him that she could handle it. He had seen it before. People came from all walks of life, thinking they could just walk in and make it on the ranch. Few lasted more than a week, and even fewer understood what it took to survive out here. "Sure," he said, tossing the reins over the horse's neck and giving her an almost mocking look. "If you think you can handle it, go on over to the barn. We've got some hay that needs stacking. You can start there." Ella's face brightened a little, but she quickly masked it. Jackson didn't know why, but he had hoped for a bit of hesitation, a retreat, something that would make it easier for him to ignore her, to get back to his life. But no, she simply nodded and turned toward the barn. The hours dragged on as Jackson worked with the rest of the hands, fixing fences, tending to the cattle, and supervising the barn. But through it all, he couldn't help but notice Ella. She was down by the haystack, moving bales with surprising efficiency for someone so young and small. She worked with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose, and something about it struck him. It wasn't just the way she lifted the bales, though she did it with determination. It was the quiet grace in how she handled every task, no matter how mundane. No complaints, no hesitation. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, Jackson's curiosity got the better of him. He approached the barn, his boots heavy against the cold dirt. Ella was still there, her hands stained with dirt, a few strands of hair falling loose from her bun. But there was no exhaustion in her eyes. Instead, there was an odd satisfaction, a feeling that she was where she belonged. "How's it going?" he asked, more out of obligation than genuine interest. "Almost done," she replied, her voice steady, though there was a hint of weariness now that the work was nearly finished. "I think I've got the hang of it." He watched her for a moment, trying to determine if she was just putting on a front or if she truly had the grit she claimed to. Finally, he gave a grunt of approval. "Not bad for your first day." Ella didn't smile, but there was a flicker of pride in her eyes. "I told you I could work hard." Something in Jackson's chest tightened. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't used to being impressed, especially by someone who had no business being here. But something about her determination, her refusal to back down, stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. "Let's see if you can keep it up," he muttered before turning away. Ella watched him go, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was certain. She wasn't about to back down. She was here to stay, and somehow, she was going to make it work. The next few days passed slowly, the cold weather making every task harder than usual. Jackson Montgomery had given Ella a handful of chores, none of which were easy, none of which would be enough to prove she could make it on the ranch. Still, she didn't complain. Each day, she showed up early and worked tirelessly until the sun dipped below the horizon, her hands calloused, her body sore, but her determination never faltering. And in the quiet moments when Jackson thought she wasn't looking, he noticed her. He noticed the way she carried herself despite the fatigue, how she had a quiet strength that seemed out of place for someone so young. And though he never said it aloud, he couldn't help but wonder if she was really cut out for the life of a rancher. It wasn't until the second week that Jackson decided to really test her. There was always more work to do on the ranch than anyone could handle in a day. Mending fences, feeding the animals, breaking horses, managing the seasonal cattle drives. It was grueling work that never ended. And so, Jackson decided to send Ella to help him with a particularly difficult task: moving a herd of cattle that had wandered too far into the neighboring valley. The land was rugged, the cattle unpredictable, and the terrain treacherous. Exactly the kind of challenge that could break a person who wasn't ready for it. The sun was barely up when they saddled the horses and set out across the snowy plains. Ella, ever determined, barely flinched at the biting cold, though Jackson noticed her shiver once or twice as they rode. He said nothing, keeping his focus on the task at hand. But every now and then, he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, watching her steady posture in the saddle, her grip on the reins tight, her face set in a look of quiet determination. They had been riding for hours by the time they reached the valley. Jackson dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow as he surveyed the herd in the distance. They had wandered into a valley that was difficult to reach, and getting them out would be no easy feat. The cattle were spooked, nervous. Jackson knew it was going to be a challenge. Ella followed him, dismounting gracefully and adjusting her coat against the chill. She looked at the herd nervously, but there was no hesitation in her movements as she reached for the rope at her side. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. He had seen the way she handled the daily chores. He wasn't going to coddle her, but he was beginning to wonder if perhaps she had what it took to make it. "I'm ready," Ella replied, her voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Jackson studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. He then nodded and took the lead. "Stay close. These cattle aren't easy to handle, and the terrain makes it even trickier. We need to move them in one go, or they'll scatter and we'll never get them back." Ella nodded, and they moved forward, splitting up to drive the cattle toward the higher ground where they'd be safer from the elements. The wind picked up, biting through their clothes, but they pressed on. The herd started moving, but not without resistance. One particularly stubborn cow broke from the group, charging toward the edge of the valley. Jackson cursed under his breath and spurred his horse forward, but before he could act, Ella was already there. She didn't hesitate. She rode hard, her horse kicking up snow as she chased after the runaway cow. Jackson's eyes widened for a moment as he watched her. He hadn't expected her to move so quickly, so decisively. She was fast on the horse, her aim true, and before he could even give her a command, She had the cow back in line, her expression fierce but focused. Jackson couldn't help but feel a flicker of respect for her. This wasn't the same girl who had shown up asking for work. This was someone who had learned quickly, someone who wasn't afraid to take risks and get the job done. They continued herding the cattle for the rest of the day, pushing them up the hill and across the rough terrain, Ella proving time and again that she was capable of keeping up with Jackson's expectations. The sun was setting by the time they finally got the cattle where they needed to be. They were exhausted, their faces windburned, their bodies aching. But there was no doubt in Jackson's mind now. Ella had more grit than he had ever given her credit for. As they rode back to the ranch, the silence between them was comfortable, but there was a new understanding in the air. Jackson glanced at Ella, noticing the small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You did good today," he said, his voice soft, almost uncharacteristically kind. Ella didn't respond right away, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Pride. Maybe. "I told you I could do it." Jackson's lips quirked up slightly, a rare, genuine smile. "You did, but don't get used to it. I'll keep pushing you." Ella laughed softly, a sound that was light and free, a stark contrast to the tough exterior she usually wore. "I wouldn't expect anything less." By the time they reached the ranch, night had fallen, and the cold was biting even more than it had been earlier. But despite the exhaustion, Ella felt a sense of accomplishment. She had made it through her first real test, and she had passed. When they dismounted, Jackson was already walking toward the barn, his boots crunching in the snow. Ella followed, still catching her breath, but feeling stronger than she had in days. She had earned her place here, and she wasn't about to let that slip away. As they approached the barn, Jackson turned to her one last time. "You did more than just prove you could handle the work," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "You proved you're a lot tougher than I gave you credit for." Ella smiled, a quiet sense of pride filling her chest. "I'm just getting started." And in that moment, Jackson Montgomery realized that maybe, just maybe, the young girl who had walked onto his ranch weeks ago wasn't just a distraction. She was someone who had the potential to change everything. The days following Ella's successful test on the ranch were both busy and revealing. Jackson found himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. She had proven herself, not only capable, but resilient in a way that struck a chord with him. He hadn't expected the small-town girl who walked onto his property weeks ago to be so determined, so hardworking. And yet, there she was, strong, unyielding, and entirely unexpected. Ella, for her part, kept her distance emotionally, as if determined to maintain the boundaries she had set for herself from the beginning. She came to the ranch to work, and she did just that. No more, no less. But in the quiet moments when they worked side by side, Jackson began to notice things. The way she could calm a frightened horse, the way her eyes sparkled with determination, even in the most difficult situations. The way she pushed through her exhaustion without a word of complaint, simply because it had to be done. There was something deeply admirable about her. The connection between them began to shift. Slowly at first, like the steady trickle of water that eventually shapes a stone. Jackson began offering her more challenging tasks. He tested her limits, asked her to handle larger projects, more difficult animals, tougher situations. And each time, Ella responded with the same relentless focus. She didn't back down, didn't shy away from challenge. There was something fierce in her spirit, something that caught his attention in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just that she could work hard, though that was enough to impress anyone. It was how she carried herself in the quiet moments. The way she laughed softly when something went wrong, never allowing herself to be discouraged. The way she treated the animals with tenderness, but also firmness, a delicate balance that reminded Jackson of how he had been raised. Ella's quick wit and warm, often sarcastic humor kept Jackson on his toes. Every conversation between them, no matter how brief, revealed a little more of who she was. One day, when the ranch had been particularly hard hit by an unexpected snowstorm, They found themselves working together to rebuild a collapsed fence. They hadn't spoken much that morning. The cold had silenced much of the usual banter. But as they worked together, side by side, Ella wiped snow from her brow and shot Jackson a grin. You could be a bit more helpful, she teased, handing him a board that needed to be nailed in place. Or do you just like watching me do all the hard work? Jackson chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I'm just letting you handle the tough stuff. Don't want to steal your spotlight. Ella rolled her eyes but smiled. I'm sure you'd like nothing more than to do the heavy lifting yourself. Not all, he said. I like leaving that to someone who can actually handle it. Ella's laugh rang out, light and genuine. For a moment, the weight of the day seemed to lift. Jackson's heart did a strange thing, his chest tightening ever so slightly. The sound of her laugh, warm and free, was enough to break through the steely, guarded walls he had built over the years. And that was a feeling he didn't expect. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the air grew colder. Jackson glanced at Ella, noticing the slight shiver that ran down her spine. Without a word, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Thanks, she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. Jackson nodded, his usual stoic expression softening slightly. You don't have to thank me. They finished the fence together in relative silence, both of them caught up in the rhythm of the work. But as they walked back to the ranch house, the unspoken understanding between them grew stronger. Jackson wasn't sure what to make of it. His life had always been about control, about knowing what to expect, about maintaining distance from people, especially women. He had learned the hard way that letting people in only led to disappointment and loss. But Ella was different. There was something about her, something fierce and untamed, that made him feel things he hadn't felt in a long time. And as much as he hated to admit it, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart were beginning to crumble. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, the air around them seemed thick with something unspoken. Ella had grown comfortable with the routine of life on the ranch, and it was clear that she was no longer the girl who had come to him for a job. She had become a fixture in his daily life. Her presence was felt even in the smallest moments. When they sat at the table, she was no longer the outsider, but someone who belonged. Over the following days, the connection between them deepened. They spent more time together, whether it was working side by side in the barn, riding out to check on the cattle, or sharing stories around the dinner table. Ella's laughter became a familiar sound in the house, something that Jackson found he craved more and more. There were still moments of tension, still that invisible wall between them that neither of them dared to cross. But as the days went on, it became clear that whatever was developing between them couldn't be ignored for long. Ella's confidence on the ranch continued to grow. She handled more responsibility, earning Jackson's respect with every passing day. Yet, there were still moments when she was caught off guard by the sheer size and complexity of the ranch. One particularly difficult day, as she was riding back to the house, she realized she had lost her way. The land all looked the same, the snow making everything appear like a blur of white and gray. Her heart raced as she tried to get her bearings, but the biting cold made it hard to think clearly. Her mind wandered to thoughts of Jackson. What would he do if he knew she was lost? Would he be disappointed? Ella wasn't sure what bothered her more, the idea of losing her way on the ranch or the thought of disappointing him. But just as she started to panic, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Jackson appeared out of the snowstorm, his horse moving at a steady pace. Lost, huh? He said with a teasing grin. Should have known better than to let you roam around alone. Ella felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been scared, but there was no time for fear now. Jackson was here, and in his presence, everything felt just a little bit safer. I'm not lost, she said, forcing a smile. I just got a little turned around. I figured, Jackson replied. Let's get you back to the ranch. They rode back together in silence. The sound of their horses' hooves the only noise in the stillness of the snow-covered landscape. As they reached the ranch, Jackson glanced at her, his eyes softening for a moment. Next time, let me know before you go wandering off. I'll help you find your way. Ella nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I will. In that moment, something shifted. Jackson Montgomery wasn't just the rancher who hired her anymore. He wasn't just the man who had given her a chance when no one else would. He was something more, someone she had come to rely on, someone whose opinion mattered far more than she cared to admit. As the days passed, that unspoken connection between them grew. The tension, the push and pull of something neither of them had anticipated, was becoming undeniable. Ella found herself thinking about Jackson in ways she hadn't expected. And Jackson, for all his effort to keep his distance, was beginning to feel something deeper for her. But neither of them were ready to acknowledge it yet. The days continued to pass on the ranch, each one blending into the next in a rhythm that felt comforting and predictable. But while life on the ranch may have been steady, the emotions stirring between Jackson and Ella were anything but. Jackson couldn't deny the growing attraction he felt for her, but he had spent so many years keeping his emotions tightly in check that it was difficult for him to trust what he was feeling. He had been hurt before, and he had no intention of letting his guard down again. Yet, each time Ella smiled at him or laughed at one of his rare jokes, his heart seemed to betray him in ways he couldn't ignore. Ella, for her part, was caught in a similar struggle. She had always been independent, relying on her own strength and determination to get through life challenges. She had always kept her emotions at a distance, knowing that love and attachment were luxuries she could not afford. But Jackson was different. There was something about him, something strong, steady, and reliable that made her want to believe in him. Still, she was cautious. She had come to the ranch to work, and that was what she intended to do. Getting emotionally involved would only complicate things. The unspoken tension between them began to build, simmering beneath the surface. There were moments when their eyes would meet, a fleeting glance that said more than words ever could. But neither of them was ready to address it directly. Ella had her reasons for keeping her emotions in check, and Jackson had his own demons to battle. For now, they remained in that liminal space, where something unsaid hovered just between them. One evening, as they worked together to bring in the cattle for the night, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. The herd was particularly difficult to manage that day, and both of them were exhausted. Jackson could see that Ella was struggling to keep up, her energy beginning to wane as the day wore on. He moved closer to her, his hand brushing hers for a brief moment, and Ella froze. Her pulse quickened, but she said nothing, unwilling to break the delicate balance they had maintained. Jackson noticed her reaction and immediately pulled back, cursing under his breath. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Ella's heart raced as she tried to steady herself. She hadn't meant to react that way. It wasn't just the physical contact that had thrown her, it was the way it felt so natural, so easy. She had spent so much of her life building walls around her heart. And here was this man, with his quiet strength and subtle gestures, breaking them down without even trying. "It's okay," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to say. She wasn't used to letting people in. But Jackson, he made it feel different. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You're not the only one who's tired," he said, his voice softer now. "We've both been working hard, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything by yourself. I'm here if you need help." Ella's gaze met his, and for a moment, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. The wall she had built up around herself began to crumble just a little. "I'm fine," she said, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. She wasn't fine. She was just doing what she had always done, carrying the weight of everything on her own shoulders. But something about Jackson's presence made her want to let go, even just a little. It terrified her. As they finished bringing in the cattle, the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle above them. Ella wiped the sweat from her brow, exhausted but satisfied with the work they had done. She had always taken pride in her ability to handle the toughest jobs. But tonight, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that Jackson had been there with her. They headed back to the barn in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jackson's mind raced. He couldn't help but think about how much he wanted to be there for her, not just as her boss, but as something more. But he had to remind himself that getting too close was a mistake. He couldn't afford to make that mistake again. He had seen how love could destroy a person, how it could turn everything upside down. Ella, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. It wasn't just the work that had brought them together, but something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore forever. The way Jackson had been there for her when she needed him, the way he had shown her a kindness that she hadn't known she needed, it made her question everything she had believed about herself. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She had never allowed herself to depend on anyone. She had learned long ago that people left, that love was fleeting, and that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. And yet, Jackson was making her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, of being seen for who she truly was. The question was, could she let herself feel that? Could she open her heart to someone again without fear of being hurt? Later that night, as they sat around the dinner table, the tension between them was palpable. Jackson glanced over at Ella, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment longer than usual. Ella met his gaze and quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. The meal was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of conversation. But even in the midst of the routine, Jackson could feel the change between them. Ella wasn't the same girl who had walked into his life weeks ago. She had become more than just a worker to him. She had become someone he cared about, someone he didn't want to lose. After dinner, they went outside to tend to the horses. The cold night air bit at their skin, but the task ahead of them required attention. As they worked in silence, Jackson couldn't help but feel that the distance between them was growing smaller, inch by inch. The walls they had both built were slowly coming down, piece by piece. Ella, too, could feel the shift. It was subtle, but undeniable. The more time they spent together, the more she realized that she didn't want to be alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Jackson Montgomery was the kind of man who could love her in a way she never thought possible. But they both knew there were still things left unsaid. The truth of their feelings hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to break at any moment. Neither of them was ready to confront it just yet, but they both knew it was coming. The question was whether they would be able to face it together, or whether the weight of their fears and uncertainties would tear them apart. The next few days were a blur for Ella, each day filled with work and the ever-present undercurrent of unspoken feelings between her and Jackson. The ranch was bustling with activity, the animals demanding attention, and the weather shifting unpredictably. But amidst all the routine, the tension between the two of them only grew stronger. Jackson had always been the solid, dependable man she'd come to admire. But now there was a new layer to him. Ella found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't anticipated, and the fear of what that meant only intensified her desire to remain emotionally distant. Ella had spent years building walls to protect herself from the world, and the idea of letting someone in again, especially someone like Jackson, terrified her. He was everything she had avoided in her past. Strong, kind, dependable, and yet, as much as she longed to let go, a part of her still held back. She didn't trust easily, and her past experiences had taught her that love could be a cruel illusion, disappearing when you least expected it. Jackson, for his part, was equally torn. He had never expected to feel this way about someone again. The relationship between them had started out of necessity, and he had thought that keeping things professional would be the easiest path. But now, every time he saw Ella, His heart would race in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let anyone get close, but Ella had found a way to break through his defenses in a way that no one else ever had. One afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Jackson's frustration reached its peak. He had been trying to fix a broken fence, his mind constantly drifting back to Ella and the way her smile had started to linger in his thoughts. It was getting harder to push those thoughts away, but he didn't know how to confront them. He didn't know how to tell her that what he felt for her went beyond the simple appreciation of her work ethic and courage. It was more than that, but he had no idea how to articulate it without making things awkward. "Jackson," Ella called, her voice cutting through the silence. He turned to find her standing nearby, wiping her hands on her jeans, a concerned look on her face. "You've been working on that fence for hours. Are you okay?" He glanced at the fence, the work unfinished, and shook his head, frustrated. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just can't get it right." Ella took a step forward, her brow furrowing with concern. "Maybe it's not the fence that's the problem." Jackson stopped, looking at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her eyes meeting his. "I've been noticing that, well, you've been a little off lately. And it's not just the fence." Jackson didn't know how to respond to that. His instinct was to pull back, to hide behind his walls once again, but there was something in Ella's gaze that stopped him. She wasn't judging him. She was just noticing. The raw honesty in her eyes made his heart race. "I've just been thinking a lot about stuff," he said after a long pause. "Things that are out of my control. Sometimes it feels like everything is slipping through my fingers, and I can't stop it." Ella nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I get that," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry all of it alone. I'm here, Jackson. You don't have to do everything by yourself." The words hit Jackson harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he had been isolating himself, how much he had been shutting out the world, even Ella. He had been so focused on maintaining control that he hadn't allowed himself the chance to feel anything. And yet, here was Ella, offering him something he hadn't expected: kindness, understanding, and maybe even the chance to let go of the burden he had been carrying for so long. Jackson looked at her, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't expected to find someone who cared about him this much, who wanted to share in the struggles he had kept buried for years. And yet, here she was. He didn't know what to do with the emotions swirling inside him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't push her away. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Ella, I've been trying so hard to keep things together, but I don't know if I can do it alone anymore. You've become so important to me, and I don't know what that means for us, but I can't keep pretending that it doesn't matter." Ella's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had known for a while now that something between them was changing, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel real. She had never been one to open up about her emotions, but something about Jackson made her want to take that risk. "I don't want you to do it alone either," she said softly. "And I don't want to keep pretending either. But we've both got a lot of baggage, Jackson. I'm not sure I can just jump into something with you without knowing it's real." Jackson swallowed hard, his eyes intense. "I'm not asking you to jump into anything, Ella. I'm just asking you to trust me, to trust that I want to be here for you. I want us to figure this out together. No more walls, no more pretending." Ella felt her heart beat faster as his words settled into her chest. She had spent so long protecting herself, but she realized now that the wall she had built was keeping out more than just pain. It was keeping out connection, keeping out the possibility of something deeper with the man standing in front of her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to consider it. "I'm scared, Jackson," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I'm ready to take the leap. Maybe we can do this together." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and vulnerable, but full of promise. Jackson stepped closer, his hand gently brushing against hers. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough. Ella looked up at him, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but she knew she didn't want to face it alone. Not anymore. Jackson smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made his eyes soften. We'll figure it out. Together. And in that moment, everything seemed to shift. The tension that had been between them for so long, the uncertainty, the fear, all of it faded into the background. What mattered now was that they had taken the first step, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed the turning point were filled with gradual changes. Ella and Jackson's relationship grew stronger each day. They weren't rushing into anything, but each step they took together felt like it was moving them closer to something deeper, something more lasting. The ranch began to feel more like a shared home rather than a place of work, and both of them found comfort in that. They worked side by side in the fields, fed the animals together, and spent their evenings talking about their hopes for the future, something neither had dared to do before. Jackson had always been the strong, silent type, but as he spent more time with Ella, he started opening up about the things that had weighed on him for so long. His fears, his regrets, his struggles with taking over the ranch after his father's death. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying alone until Ella came into his life. Her presence was a quiet reassurance that he didn't have to face everything by himself. And though it took time for him to fully accept this, he began to trust her more than he had trusted anyone in years. Ella, for her part, slowly let down the wall she had built around herself. It wasn't easy. Old habits of self-preservation were hard to break. But with Jackson, she felt like she could breathe again. She had spent so many years fearing the pain of loss. But with him, she began to understand that there was more to life than avoiding hurt. She didn't have to hide away from the world or from her feelings. She could be vulnerable, and it wasn't as terrifying as she had always imagined. The warmth of Jackson's steady presence made her feel safe, like she had found a place where she truly belonged. One Sunday afternoon, after another long day of work, they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun dip low behind the distant hills. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the air had the crispness of an early autumn evening. Ella leaned back in her chair, resting her head against the wood, and Jackson sat beside her, his hand naturally reaching for hers. It was the kind of peaceful moment they had come to cherish, a quiet understanding between them that they didn't need to say anything to know that this was right. "This is nice," Ella said softly, her voice carrying a hint of contentment. Jackson turned to her, his expression relaxed but thoughtful. "Yeah, it is. I never imagined it would feel like this." Ella smiled at him, her fingers curling around his. "What do you mean?" He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I guess I always thought I'd be alone in this. The ranch. My life. But having you here, with me, it's more than I expected. I didn't think I could want something more, but here you are, and I can't imagine it any other way now." Her heart fluttered at his words. "I didn't expect it either, Jackson. But somehow, I found a way to stop running from it. From you." She paused, her gaze falling to their intertwined hands. "I'm not used to trusting people, but you've made me realize that it's okay to let someone in." Jackson squeezed her hand, the weight of his own feelings reflected in the way his eyes softened as he looked at her. "I'm glad, Ella. You've made me realize the same thing." The quiet moment stretched out between them, but this time it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was a peace that they had both worked hard to find, a peace that came from mutual understanding and a growing love that had slowly but surely blossomed. As the evening wore on, Jackson stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, let's go inside. I'll make you some of that hot cocoa you like." Ella grinned, standing up to join him. "You're a terrible cook, Jackson." He raised an eyebrow, a mischievous smile tugging at his lips. "I'll have you know, I make the best cocoa this side of the Rockies." Ella laughed, shaking her head as she followed him inside. Despite the light-hearted teasing, there was a new sense of ease in their interactions. They were comfortable with each other in ways they hadn't been before. What had started out as an unlikely partnership had evolved into something so much more. Later that night, as they sat down to a simple but satisfying dinner, Ella couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. There had been times when she thought she'd never find happiness again, but here she was, sitting across from Jackson, with the sense of belonging she had always longed for. The past was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer defined her. She had a new chapter ahead of her, and it was one she was eager to embrace. As the days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. They continued to build their life together on the ranch, a life filled with hard work, laughter, and love. Jackson proved to be everything Ella had ever hoped for: steady, reliable, and caring. He didn't try to rush her into anything, giving her the time she needed to fully trust him. And she did. She trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone. And with that trust came the realization that she wanted to spend her life with him. One crisp morning, Jackson took her hand and led her out to the fields. The sky was clear, and the first hints of spring were in the air. He stopped at the edge of a small patch of land, where wildflowers had begun to bloom. Turning to her, he took a deep breath before speaking. "Ella, we come a long way, haven't we?" She smiled, looking out at the land that had become their home. "We have." Jackson paused for a moment, his hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, simple box and opened it to reveal a delicate silver ring, the diamond catching the sunlight. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, her heart racing. "Ella, will you marry me?" Jackson asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Will you share this life with me, for as long as we both shall live?" Tears sprang to Ella's eyes as she looked at the man she had come to love. She had never imagined that she would find someone like him, someone who understood her, cared for her, and made her feel like she wasn't alone. She had found her home, not in a place, but in him. "Yes, Jackson. Yes, I'll marry you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. With a wide smile, Jackson slid the ring onto her finger, sealing their future together. They embraced, the weight of their journey finally lifting as they looked toward a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings. As they stood there in the early morning light, their hands intertwined, the world seemed to open up before them, full of possibilities. The life they had built together was just beginning, and with each other by their side, they knew they could face whatever came their way. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they had found something worth fighting for. And in that moment, they knew they were home.